3, 2.
All right, welcome to anyone who's watching this recording. I am Kimberly Wilburn, one of the board members of Plymouth Area Indivisible, and I am joined by Greg Layden, who is also a board member of Plymouth Area Indivisible.
And a pirate.
And and we are here today to talk to Simon Trautmann, who is the candidate for Hennepin County Attorney. And so I will start off, Simon, by letting you introduce yourself and then give us your stump speech.
Well, thank you. And do we want the 2 minute or the 5 minutes or the 10-minute stump speech? I think folks want the 2 minutes.
You know what? Do share as much as you want.
Well, thank you for that. Yeah, and thank you for making a forum like this available to talk about the county attorney's race. So my name's Simon Trautmann, and I'm a twice elected council member in the city of Richfield, and I'm a Puerto Rican attorney who built a law firm that I'm incredibly proud of. And we, about a decade ago, moved that law firm from Eden Prairie to Elliott Park, which is about 100 feet from where I was born. And I've had the privilege and to live out of my passions and take my vision for how we can practice law, which is rooted in attorney and staff mental health and joy, and build a practice that serves everybody, but primarily people of color, primarily Black and brown folks and first-generation immigrants. We have a full criminal practice, but we also have a robust practice, and so much of my work is not just when folks are being held accountable or being accused of crime, which usually is the worst day of their life, but also the best days of our life when we're building power and we're building wealth. And I have the privilege of every day seeing where people are normally at the margins, exceeding and excelling. As a council member, I've had the opportunity to cast vision and be present during a season of great transition in the city of Richfield. When I was elected, we became the first majority Latino council in state history, with a staff that at every level of leadership, from supervisor up to executive, was not diverse. And so my campaign, which I'm incredibly grateful to have the support of the last DFL endorsed candidate, Mark Hazy, and George Floyd's family, and Tashira Garraway, who's another incredible survivor of the trauma of the government taking the life of her partner, and many other community members, suburban mayors like Ron Case, and Mayor of Eden Prairie, and our mayor in Richfield, but along with folks right in my neighborhood in Elliott Park. And in my campaign, we talk about the difference between policy reform and reckoning and repair. And I think it's hard to look at what we are experiencing as a community and not recognize there are multiple reckonings taking place. George Floyd and his death, and Dante Wright, and is an expression of a reckoning. It's an expression of a gap of justice that lots of folks already knew existed, but we became more conscious of that. Also, the increase in violence and the decrease in trust is its own kind of reckoning. And the response is not just policy, certainly policy reform, but it has to be something deeper. It has to be something more substantive than that. And so I'm really looking forward to a more extended conversation where we can talk about the policy, but we can also communally, collectively raise our expectation for justice. And so with that, thank you. Thank you for this forum, and I'll stand for any questions.
Okay, great. And yes, we definitely wanted to get into some more of what you said. But to start off with, can you tell us just more about your background as a lawyer, your schooling, degrees, administrative experience,
Sure.
that sort of thing?
No, absolutely. So let's see, background, degrees, administrative experience. We'll start with this. My background, I was born at Hennepin County Medical Center, right on the edge of downtown, and my law practice now is about 100 feet from there in an old mansion, the Hinkle Murphy Mansion. So my undergrad was actually in international education, and I graduated in 2003 and promptly moved to a city in central China by the name of Wuhan. And so there's a city nobody had heard of until 18 months ago. And so I established an international school there. I was with a group of folks that's still growing and thriving to this day. I had the privilege of bringing my mother to Wuhan, who ultimately she was one of the first Minnesotans to die of COVID. And so a little bit about my story, it is I don't know if ironic's the right word, but when I think of the COVID virus, it actually, both the wet market and the biolab were in the part of Wuhan where I lived. And so to have that virus on the other side of the world come around and touch not just my life, but everybody's life is very humbling. But I took my LSATs in China. I got a full ride to the University of St. Thomas, and then had the privilege of building a law practice. I started practicing in 2008, the middle of the pandemic. In addition to practicing criminal law, like I mentioned, I had the opportunity to build a practice with people within my network, which tends to be a more diverse network. And as a lawyer, you have the ability not just to advocate for people, but to build something beautiful in other people's organizations, and then to build your own. So a little less than a decade ago, I started my own practice, and we took it from an idea in my mind to now I have an incredible law partner in Graham Martin, and we settled on a core value of happy, healthy attorneys and staff members. My cousin, Jesse Trautmann, incredible lawyer, leader, tragically took his life about a decade ago. And it was the same month I decided to launch my own practice. And people may not know this, but the practice of law has some of the highest incidence of substance abuse and the highest incidence of mental health challenges. And so I decided that the practice of law was too tough to be miserable in the practice of law. And as I have the privilege of leading lawyers and leading teams of lawyers, it's incredibly powerful to ground my leadership in their thriving, in their prospering, in their mental health. And I'm very grateful that lawyers seem to like that also. and so we have a lot of shared values in our firm, and we have a lot of passion for the work and for the clients that we serve. And so when we serve our clients in the criminal space, in the corporate space, but also the county attorney's office actually has two offices. One office is, if you go to the county attorney's office, you take a left, it's the criminal division, and you take a right, and it's the civil division. And as much disparity as there is when it comes to people of color and people with less financial resources in the criminal justice system, there are very similar experiences that people, especially people of color, especially my clients, have in the civil division. And there are a lot of people of goodwill in the county, but there are also a lot of broken systems. And so we have the privilege of strategically and persistently advocating for folks on both sides of the county attorney's office. Two other pieces about my leadership and about the folks that we serve. We might have a chance to talk about this a little bit more later, but one of the cases that I'm proudest of the work that not just I've done, but our team has done. We recently won a civil rights case that made it possible for folks that are on probation to participate in things like the county convention and all parts of the county leadership for the first time. That resulted because Noah McCourt, incredible organizer, leader, disability rights advocate, came and he said, I'm on probation and I can't, I'm the chair of the DSL Disability Caucus, but I can't actually vote on the DSL platform. Does that seem right? Does that seem constitutional? And we thought, well, no, it didn't. And the courts decided that Noah could not be fined. he could not be criminally penalized. It wouldn't be a violation of his probation, and that if the government threatens to do something, that's enough to limit people's speech rights. And so that's another facet of law that's really important when you think about the county attorney's office, because civil rights, in addition to criminal law, it's actually a different discipline of law. And we need not just criminal justice, but we really need procedural justice. And so I was born in South Minneapolis and the southwest suburbs, and I grew up mostly in Richfield. Our family moved around a lot. We ended up in Richfield, and now I'm very honored to serve on my second term as a city council member. And we've had the privilege and the challenge of really reckoning with a community that's changed. When my family bought our home in West Richfield, there was some suspicion in the neighborhood. It was a Puerto Rican family. What was that going to do to our property values? It seems absurd to talk about it now. That was the reality back then. Now our city is more diverse than the city of Minneapolis. But our staff and our bureaucracy had not made that change. So what we have the opportunity to do, and still have the opportunity to do as a council, is to, one, reflect our community, all of our community, but also have tough, sometimes beautiful conversations, but often tough conversations about the gap of experience, the gap of trust, and what we can do to substantively make government more responsive, increase communication, increase transparency, and also increase cultural competency, both by equitable hiring and through making sure we have hard conversations.
Okay. And if we have time, I want to talk to you about what it is you do to protect the mental health of the people that work for you. But
that sounds great.
Right now, I want to move on and tell me, how do you define public safety?
That's a great question. So I would define public safety as something more than not violence being acted upon you, because I'm frankly concerned and heartbroken that with every violent story that hits the news, our expectation for safety and justice gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So public safety starts to look like, and from one perspective, I hope the police don't do violence to me. That's a real fear that needs to be named. But the absence of violence is not the presence of public safety. In other parts of our community, people say, well, I want to see crime lower. And it really has to be more than lower crime. Public safety looks like people enjoying themselves at night on the street in their parks. Bishop Howell over at Shiloh Temple is a great supporter, endorser of our campaign. We've unfortunately shared a lot of time in the last 2 months. We've been to 3 funerals of 3 young men, and Jamari Rice in my ward in Richfield, and Amir Locke, and then most recently Deshaun Hill. And what he said about Deshaun, who was a quarterback over in North Minneapolis, he said that quarterbacks need they need offensive linemen to protect them, and they create a pocket. They said we need to create a pocket for young men to grow up in, and that's what public safety. I could not say it better than Bishop Howell. That it's our obligation as representatives in government, as community leaders, as advocates, to create a pocket for people that are vulnerable, and for everybody.
Okay. So over the last few years, we've seen the Hennepin County Sheriff's Department try new things in policing. So can you give us an overview of that and what you think about it, and what do you think has worked? What do you think can be done better? And what will you do to continue and to improve from the point of view of the county attorney, should you be elected?
You said county sheriff, and that's how I was.
Yeah.
So about the county attorney or about the sheriff and as legal counsel for the sheriff?
Yeah, so in your role as county attorney,
Yes.
how will you interact with the sheriff? So first
Yes.
of all, what do you think of what the changes the sheriff's department has made and how things are going in policing from the sheriff's department? And then what would you, as county attorney, in your interaction with the sheriff's department,
Sure.
how would you? Yeah.
No, it's a large office, and so there are things that I appreciate, and there are things that I'm more concerned about. And maybe I wouldn't presume if you share these concerns, but there are a lot of tough decisions that have to be made when there's a crisis environment, and there are emergent situations. And so I recognize I don't have all the facts, but I can say I was concerned when the mayor in Brooklyn Center took on the role of the chief of police, and the county unilaterally removed that from him. And without knowing all the facts on the ground, it's hard to say definitively, but I will say structurally, as a city elected leader, and I'm sure you feel this way too, that there's a rule of law and there's how things function. And part of the role of the county attorney, again, that's outside the criminal space. This is civil law, this is administrative law, this is what council members, this is what administrative lawyers deal with. We want to know, we want to know how the law works in practice, and I'm concerned that even though the statute said that the mayor had the authority to make certain decisions, that the county went in and took those decisions over unilaterally. And so part of the job of the county attorney is to set those legal parameters in which the sheriff can and cannot operate. And we're accountable for those decisions. One thing I think that the sheriff has done that I am a huge fan of, something called the HOPE program. And that's a program within the county jail, and the sheriff is responsible for administrating the county jail, and the county attorney's office is legal counsel for the county jail. But Sheriff Hutchinson has begun a program that provides educational services within the jail. And I think there are some programs like that in the prison, but sometimes if you're there for 48 hours, you're there for a week, you're there for a month, there are real resources, there are real tools, there are real opportunities that people have. And I think it's good for safety, it's good for disrupting patterns of criminal behavior, and it's good for casting people's vision beyond their current incarceration, which is really critical. And so I think he should be commended for having the vision to begin that program. And I think it really needs to be scaled.
Okay. So speaking of the county jail and Hennepin County is known as the county that is really good at putting Black people in jail. Why is that, and what would your response be to that as a county attorney?
Well, part of reckoning and repair is saying that clearly and often, because we have to root any policy change in the painful reality that we have, that in a lot of ways the system isn't broken, it's working as it was designed, and we need to understand why it was designed that way and be accountable for why it was designed that way. I'll share a brief story, and then I'll answer the question more directly. But one of the organizations I'm proud to have started, and it's called City Leaders Against Wage Theft and Tax Fraud, and it's a group of electeds from more than 20 cities. Kizzy Coakley, one of your colleagues, is a part of that organization, and we gather together to fight wage theft, which is not currently prosecuted in the county attorney's office. Up to 1 in 4 workers in the construction trade experience wage theft. When you start selecting for people of color, that number skyrockets, which is not people being arrested, but these are victims. We're going to flip it in a second here, but that's part of the reckoning of the realities are when you are a corporation or your employer and you steal from workers, there's no system of criminal accountability for those thefts. I had a case several years ago with an African-American man that I knew well in his late 40s, maybe early 50s, father of 4, homeowner in the south suburbs. And he was accused by his employer of stealing a cell phone. When he was confronted, he said, "I meant to return this cell phone, and here it is." The cell phone was recovered. The law enforcement made a choice to go to his second job to arrest him over the used cell phone and bring him to the county jail. And so part of the reckoning is how many government employees for a corporation that said this person needs to be held accountable. We had 3 government investigators in the form of police, and we had 3 lawyers prosecuting that. And we had the county lockup system to hold his body over a cell phone that was recovered. Those are decisions that are not necessarily made by the sheriff. The sheriff has discretion for the deputies, but the large majority of those decisions are actually made at the city level in cities like Minnetonka and Richfield that don't have our own detention systems, but contract with the county. And so the county jail is not necessarily making, as I understand, the determination of whether or not people are going to be released, but that's actually the county attorney's office, and that's local. That's local cities. If there is not a public safety concern, and there is not a concern that people are going to be present, people shouldn't be incarcerated. If there is a public safety concern, and we have an opportunity to use tools like home-based detention and community-based detention, those are tools we need to scale. But I want to say, as I say that, I want to recognize the danger of overusing tools like home monitoring that can be used and then sometimes overused to keep people under carceral control when they need to be prospering. But as an alternative, especially when it comes to youth that are being held accountable, especially in light of the fact that we've defunded and closed a lot of youth detention and youth diversion programming, that's another tool that we have. Low-level drug offenses are disproportionately prosecuted in communities of color. The statistics that I've read and that I've experienced that white folks use drugs at similar levels to communities of color, and in fact, affluent white folks use drugs the most illegally, but are least likely to be held accountable. And so recognizing that those are the dynamics, and that we all, when people struggle, and I mentioned my law partner comes from a chemical dependency background, has been sober for 10 years. And I'm very grateful for him. I'm delighted that when he struggled with alcohol, he didn't have a criminal record and got the help he needed. And now, a decade into his practice, is an extraordinary leader, an extraordinary attorney, and doing justice every day. And so, what do we do with the jail specifically? We have influence on the charging decisions. We also this is maybe an opportunity to talk about bail reform also, which is constitutional and statutory limitations that we have on bail. But as long as you can trade money for liberty, people with more money, they have more liberty. That's definitionally true. So what we need to do is, we do not have good data on bail and bail practices. We need better data. The courts may have some of that data, and it's not been released yet. So to the extent they have it, we want it released. But we can do a better job using risk assessment tools to make sure people are going to be keep communities safe and show up to their court hearings, and not use wealth as a proxy for determining whether people are a risk to community or not.
Okay. You asked or you answered several of my questions I haven't asked yet, and that's fine. But that's fine. That's good.
We can go deeper.
No, that's fine. I want to well, first I want to ask you about guns, and then I want to talk a little bit about the relationship between the county attorney's office and
Yes.
police.
Yes.
So guns.
Yes.
What would you, as county attorney, what would you do about guns and gun violence?
Well, we have to reckon with the facts, and the facts are that gun violence is increasing, and also gun violence is increasing not just in Hennepin County, but it's increasing in rural communities. It's increasing across the country, and so in one sense, we have to look past the noise of local politics and say we are national trends of increased gun purchase, lower confidence, in more exceeding hopelessness, particularly with youth. When youth commit violent crimes, to me, it's an expression of extraordinary hopelessness. And so there are. Let me just step back for a second and just talk specifically about guns. We can talk about youth violence specifically. That's something we need to talk about. But when it comes to guns and how they're being used right now, one, to the extent that we can refocus our time and resources on violent crimes as opposed to low-level drug enforcement, we have more resources to hold more people accountable when they engage in violent crimes, particularly gun crimes. When it comes to the bail process and setting terms of release, making sure that we are seeking the surrendering of firearms when people are accused of violent crimes, and that I'm not suggesting that doesn't happen all the time, but making that a policy to say that if you're accused of violent crimes, you in addition to having no contact presumptively with the presumed victim, you're not going to have access to firearms. So we're removing those guns from those combustible situations, and then also very, very specifically, one thing that I'm concerned about, and if you haven't heard about switches yet, you will this summer, and those are, it looks like the little screw, like a bolt, like something you could buy at Home Depot, but it has the ability to instantly turn a semi-automatic weapon into an automatic weapon. And I have the privilege of serving on an organization called Team Renewed that provides housing and employment opportunities for returning citizens, people that have been held accountable by the justice system and are returning. We were at a board meeting a couple of months ago at one of our homes in North Minneapolis, and the next morning, it's about 10 a.m., 11 a.m., somebody came by, 14 bullets in the living room where we were sitting. And the volume of, it's not just the gun, but it's the volume of bullets that's increasing. There are 20,611 bullets that were fired in Minneapolis. And that, again, that's something that we have to reckon with. And so as I appreciate, and I'm a fan of John Choi and his leadership and banning pretextual stops, but even John Choi has recognized that when we catch, if it's a legal stop and we find a gun, we're taking the guns. And part of the role of the county attorney is to make hard decisions, and those are some of the decisions that you need to make. That if we have an opportunity to take illegal guns out of the community, we need to seize those opportunities.
Okay. I think I'm going to let Greg ask the next question.
Thanks. And before I do, I just want to note that when you fire a bullet, a piece of lead comes off the bullet and goes into the environment. So shooting ranges are actually toxic waste sites or toxic point sites because of that. And You just told me that Minneapolis is a toxic point source for lead, I think. I'm
Mm.
serious. That's actually,
Mm.
we have a problem with lead. I don't know what the
Yeah.
number of units of lead comes off when you fire one bullet. I'm looking it up now, but it's going to add up. Anyway, if that's annual, because it doesn't go away.
It's so, and what it does, unfortunately, is it erodes trust. You ask what public safety looks like,
Right.
and it's not just the absence of the bullet being fired, but it's the presence of people walking in parks.
Right.
It's
and breathing safely.
and breathing safely.
Yeah.
And letting children play, and having your first concern not be are they at risk of profound violence from guns.
Okay, so Simon, here's my question. A bit
Yes,
complicated, but when I Google carjackings in Minneapolis, I get a gazillion hits, and the top hits point to things like stories in MinPost. Police 125 carjackings in Minneapolis over the last 2 months. Twin City carjacking crisis, a closer look. 90% of reported Minneapolis carjacking is unsolved, etc. When I narrow the search to the last 30 days, I get only one story repeated in many outlets, and it's about a conviction of someone, sentencing of someone who for 15 years or something. It's one story repeated in all the outlets for the last 30 days. When I talk to people on Nextdoor and hear what people say, and one of the most recent stories is about how legislators are introducing bills to make carjacking a specific kind of crime, blah, blah, blah. So here's the thing. When people become frightened, especially us suburbanites, because we are easily startled, we become frightened of a crime wave. We then go and pressure our legislators to pass more laws or get tough on crime or blah, blah, blah. And that puts the people like the Hennepin County Attorney, you've got to follow the law. And if the law is a product of frightened legislators responding to frightened citizens, then we get laws that may not be appropriate. When I look at the actual data on carjacking, I see two things. First, we're at our lowest point in weeks. There's been a huge drop. The wave people talk about it ended in January. There's a longer wave that goes back to August 9th, 2020, and the carjacking wave corresponds precisely to the COVID wave. Or it almost looks like carjacking causes COVID. If you wanted to make a spurious correlation, it looks like
if you see the correlation and causation,
it might be the opposite. The point is, it's a COVID related phenomenon. It is over. But in the minds of suburbanites, we demand action, even though it has been resolved through a number of reasons. It's resolved. My question for you is this: as Hennepin County Attorney, can you see yourself implementing some kind of a policy, and I actually have a suggestion for a policy that would help the press stop misinforming the public about the back end of crime waves and giving people a better idea so that they aren't demanding irresponsible action? And I think about back when I was in graduate school, and it was very common in public spaces. I was studying human evolution. For human evolution to be badly represented and be badly done by the science press. And I ended up sitting in a classroom as a graduate student with Roger Lewin, the top science reporter in human evolution areas, because MIT funded sending reporters to school. And after that 2 or 3 year period, while these reporters went to school, graduate school, on MIT's program, and they still have this program for science, the quality of science reporting in that area went to the point where it was actually acceptable instead of abysmal. Is there a way to get the press on board with reporting accurately, timely, and useful, and not misleading and not overwrought information about crime, in order to help you do your job and get the legislature back out of those rabbit holes?
Question is, would I send reporters to graduate school so we can get on the same page?
Well, that would be one way to do it. But what other ways to do it? No,
well, so let me take a couple parts of that question. One is just recognizing, what you point. There are several things that are happening. One is that there is an increase of carjacking, and I think in some part surely correlated with COVID, also correlated with the fact that you used to be able to very easily or I guess reasonably easily, steal a car without a clicker, without a key. And so the fact that you now have a key creates a dynamic where you have to interact with a person to get the car fob in order to steal the car. So what was a non-violent property crime has now become a much more dangerous and violent crime against somebody's person, which is much more violent. It creates it's more frightening, frankly, and potentially more dangerous if somebody is assaulted or somebody is violently beaten, or God forbid worse. So I just want to recognize that those things are not in our heads; those are in our bodies and our lived experience, in our collective consciousness. And so I'm not opposed to recognizing that and dealing with it directly. A lot of one of the ways to deal with it directly, and I think the county attorney's office may already be doing this, is to be able to effectively process really complicated crime scenes. County attorneys can be more present in local law enforcement agencies. And I hope we have a chance to talk about that a little bit different, the interaction between a local law enforcement and the county attorney's office, because we have dozens of chiefs of police and different police departments that all have their own infrastructure, their own unions. They almost all, as a council member Wilburn knows, there's multiple unions within local police departments. And so being able to have a more effective relationship with law enforcement is really important. And I think that's something that in the media cycle, in the news cycle, has become more apparent. I think people were maybe more aware of the strain between communities, particularly communities of color, in the county attorney's office. People were less aware that local law enforcement agencies have similar lower levels of trust, frustration, lack of communication. So being present with them, sometimes we take for granted that somebody steals a car, there's an assault. When they get the car, they drive one place, then they steal another car, and they do that 3 or 4 times. It's actually a very complicated crime scene to process. And as that crime increases, we have more officers that are having to do that work for the first time, and the county can be present in being a partner in holding in helping police process the scenes and get the evidence we need to make those cases. A lot of these cases involve youth, and we're exposing the lack of not just because detention is not always the right situation, but if somebody is serially engaged in violent crime, this is a time for people to be removed from community. And we have an opportunity to reinvest in facilities that we've closed. There are reasons why we closed them. We also have an opportunity to increase things like home monitoring, particularly for young people. And a lot of times situations like this involve chemical dependency issues, mental health issues. And so court dates are so backed up right now that you could wait 3, 4, 5, 6 months before you get a hearing. And actually what somebody needs is, there may be programming that can help people in addition to holding them accountable, because accountability is coming, but if it comes 6 months, a year down the road, that we're missing opportunities, especially with young people, because their brains are developing. So you wait 6 months, a year, and not only is there reckless behavior that continues and criminal behavior that continues, but we're just losing time where we could be intervening.
So we had a few people who joined us, so I'm just gonna let them know if you have any questions for Simon to put those in the chat, and we will try to get to them at the end of our session here. So let's talk a little bit more about the relationship with local police. So as you mentioned, it's important to for the county attorney to be able to to work with local police. You know, the police are responsible for doing the investigation, providing the evidence to the county attorney. But the county attorney is also responsible for prosecuting officers accused of wrongdoing.
Yeah.
And there has recently been a lot of public mistrust
Yeah.
in the county attorney, feeling that the county attorney has not been as vigorous in prosecuting officers
Yeah.
because of that relationship. So how do you deal with having a working relationship with police, but also being the office that prosecutes those that are accused of wrongdoing?
Absolutely. So there are multiple ways to attack this problem, but there are also multiple problems embedded in that problem. You named the first one, which is a lack of trust. And we see that in multiple directions, you know, lack of trust between community and the county attorney's office, and already lack of trust between the county attorney's office and law enforcement. So there is, and I have to name it, there's a conflict of interest that exists when you work with somebody, you rely on those people, and then you turn around on the next day and you say, and now you're coming into my office, and now we have reason to believe you committed a crime. You'll be held accountable. That's a conflict of interest. We just have to name it. There are different ways that we can deal with that. I think in addition to, I'm not a big fan of outsourcing those cases to another county, but I do think we can create a more transparent, more collaborative process that invites more community members to that decision. And when I say community, I'm not suggesting like a civilian review authority, but other, potentially the Attorney General's office, potentially the Department of Justice, so that there is accountability that exists outside of the office that has that direct conflict of interest, and also increases transparency between government agencies, which also makes it harder to sweep things under the rug. But even more than that, we have to transcend the cultural expectations that exist within law enforcement, that exist within the county attorney's office. I had a very difficult but really important conversation with a delegate who's a retired police officer who invited me. He's also a lay minister, and invited me to his church. And I shared a story about a citizen in Richfield who got a ticket for essentially parking while black in our neighborhood. And he had called me about that, and I was frustrated, I was upset. But I shared that story with Dr. Chris Brooks, an incredible venture capitalist who owns the only Black-owned, BIPOC-focused venture tech fund in Minnesota. I think probably the 5 or 10 state area. But when I shared that story with him, he got a 1,000-yard stare at the airplane seat in front of us, and he just said, when I was a child, I was 14, I mouthed off to the police. I shouldn't have done it, but they took me to Minnehaha Falls. They beat the you-know-what out of me, and they dumped me off in the middle of the city. And part of what I have to do as a policymaker, as an elected leader, is to recognize there's a difference from my response, which was an empathetic response, and Dr. Brooks' response, and he gave me permission to share this story, which is a trauma-informed response. And I share that story to say that when I share the story in that forum, in that church basement where I was invited, or the church fellowship hall where I was invited to speak, and I talked about it, so we need to reckon with this kind of police violence. And that good man, who I'm grateful for his support as a delegate, had a full body triggered response. His face changed, his countenance changed. He started to yell. He started to point. He said, "You won't do that. I'm going to leave. I'm going to shut this down." And we had a very powerful but difficult discussion. And I said, "I'm not going to leave." And we have to reflect that if he were not a minister, but he were in uniform and we were having this conversation, my liberty would be in jeopardy. And he came up afterwards, after that conversation, and I said, and I know I'm talking to a police officer here right now, not a minister. And he said, you know, you're right. You're talking to the police officer, not a minister. But this is the thing that I find the most painful about this story, is that even in that moment, as a retired officer, the empathy was not for a child that was violently captured by the government and beaten. The empathy was for the idea of police and police's reputation. And that good man, and I want to say he's a good man. He said after the meeting, he said, what you said happened sounds like something that would have happened when I was on the force, back when you said that happened. And so that's why it's more than just a policy change. It's important that we change the policy. It's important that all of us are held accountable, but even more than that, we really have to center these conversations. These conversations have not been centered in the office of the county attorney like they need to be. And if we don't have those conversations, we don't actually reckon with what's happened, we can't actually move forward, because we can't understand the difference between my empathetic response and Dr. Brooks' trauma-informed response. And to be fair, the trauma that law enforcement also experienced, the complex PTSD that many people who serve in extraordinarily difficult circumstances, that they also have to have the space to be able to reckon with that.
Oh, sorry. So kind of following up on that, talking about police accountability, and what is the current situation when it comes to the situation on the ground with police and interactions, particularly with people of color? And what are we seeing now, and what are you doing, and what would you do to influence positive change in that area?
So let me talk on a ground level, on a practical level, and then at a higher level too. One of the things that we've been able to do in the city of Richfield, and as a result in part of that circumstance with that resident, is to make sure that officers know the constitutional limits of their powers. And so part of that, you know, we all have roles to play in public safety. And part of the role of the county attorney and the prosecutor's office is to train and share with officers like we had in Richfield. Our prosecutor came in and did a training on what the limits were when you can, not that they hadn't done that before, but with a sharper clarity. This is where people's liberty begins. This is where the Constitution creates barriers to protect people to be safe in their person and personal effects. Doing that kind of training and having that kind of regular routine interaction between the county attorney's office and local law enforcement is really important. Also, we have, excuse me. Also, I'm going to continue to emphasize these kinds of interactions because once there is a tragedy and a loss of life, you know that story is going to make the news, but the amount of dialogue that we can have in that story, it's too late. There's not much to talk about. And where we do have the opportunity as lawyers with law enforcement, as partners with police and law enforcement, is to build again and again bridges of trust that are rooted in law and rooted in empathy. One personal experience and then a current example. When I was an undergrad in South Minneapolis, and as a very light-skinned Puerto Rican man with a German last name, you know, I'm adjacent to a lot of experiences that are often not my own. And I had a pretty unscientific research project as an undergrad, but I convinced my research team, so we're going to go and we're going to give a police brutality and abuse of power survey in South Minneapolis. And we went to Park and Lake Street. There's a Somali and a black-owned grocery store. And then we took another team and we went down to Lund's Byerly's in Uptown, about 8 blocks over. And 100% of the adults we surveyed in the Phillips neighborhood had often multiple, but all had personal experience, not just with police abuse of power, but everybody had personal experience and they knew people. At Lund's and Byerly's, not only was it all Caucasian, but nobody had had a personal experience with police abuse of power, and nobody knew of anybody who had an experience with police abuse of power. And that's how big the gap of experience is. So how do we hold people accountable? I think we look, again, I have not seen all the materials that the current county attorney's office has seen. So I want to put that caveat out there. But the difference between a policy reform, we have the tragedy of Jaleel Stallings and not Jaleel Stallings, but Amir Locke in his death at the hands of law enforcement. And so the mayor famously talked about reforming no-knock warrants. The state legislature took action to reform no-knock warrants. But Jaleel Stallings, many people might be aware of that case. It's not as famous because fortunately, he did not lose his life, but he was a military veteran that had a concealed carry permit, and there were officers that were joking into their body camera. We captured on body cameras. They were hunting protesters and then engaged in behavior that looked remarkably like that. And an unmarked van began to fire shots at Mr. Stallings. He returned fire as soon as he heard police. He dropped his gun, but he was violently beaten, and the county attorney's office chose to attempt to hold him accountable and charge him, I believe it was with attempted murder. Those officers not only were not held accountable, but they were in the room when Amir Locke lost his life. And if we don't reckon with that, we don't reckon with that system, with that process, the policy of what we do with no-knock warrants, whether we take the door, whether we breach and hold with the door, whether we wait, there are a myriad of policy options, but we actually have to reckon with that culture that doesn't hold people accountable. And the county attorney has the authority to do that and needs to do that.
What role would the county attorney have, do you think, when it comes again to relationships with police and holding accountable? If you become aware of behaviors that maybe don't rise to the level of something that requires prosecution, how can the county attorney play a role there?
No, thanks for that question. What I'm proposing is that we create an office of procedural integrity within the county attorney's office that creates not just the will, because I think it's really important that whoever the county attorney is, we're not just relying on the strong will of one person, but we're actually improving the structures, the bureaucracy, the subroutines that happen on a daily basis, so that when nobody has the will, we have the institutional practice and competency to do not just the right thing, but the better thing. And so an office of procedural integrity gives the county the opportunity not just to hold law enforcement accountable, but hold ourselves accountable as the county attorney. And also just returning to the theme and the fact that there are multiple divisions, and there are, it's less than half, but I think about 40% of the office is civil. We need spaces and systems where community can hold all parts of the government accountable. We represented a family where there was a young first generation immigrant woman, and her mother had misstated her income on a medical assistance application, not her mother. And the government took the position that not only did her mother owe $17,000, but this daughter who was new to this country owed $17,000 based on no rule of law. And when we pressed the case, they just said, well, this is just our policy. This is what we do. There are things like that that happen routinely within our government structure, and we need systems that hold all areas. The news is a powerful tool. As Greg mentioned, what do we do to help impact those narratives? One of the things we can do is just really have field vision that sees the criminal injustice, but also make space for procedural injustice in all parts of the county.
So you talked a little bit about the Amir lock specifically and
Yeah.
no knock warrants. I don't know. So I don't know enough about what, I mean, I know that they chose not to charge any of the officers involved in the Amir lock case. I don't know enough about what specifically happened and what the law says to have
Yes.
an opinion on that specific case. But what are your feelings on no knock warrants? And as county attorney, where would you weigh in on that?
Well, we can start with my feelings, which are outrage and deep grief, and frustration is too small a word. Not just with the tragedy of his loss of life, but also with the at least reckless and potentially more sinister slandering of his good name by calling him a suspect initially. And so those are one of those what did we know and when did we know it questions. And why did law enforcement refer to this innocent man as a suspect? What gave them the basis for making that accusation? Those are my feelings. And for anybody, I'm so grateful that I've never lost a child. Love my boys and I hug them tightly every night. But I've had the honor and the horror of sitting with families on the day they get that terrible news. When police are responsible and after police have done everything they could to save people, and it feels just the same. And so starting with feelings, I think, is really important. When it comes to the actual trial, I agree from what I know and what I've seen with both Mike Freeman and Attorney General Keith Ellison, that the law as it stands, I don't see the evidence that allows you to charge a crime with the law as it currently is. And as much as I'm concerned about who we put in the room and how we keep officers accountable, I'm also concerned that there's judgment in their practices. Just because you take a door doesn't mean you have to go into the room. And there's a difference between breaching and no knock and breaching and holding, and no knock and breaching and charging in. Even decisions like that, could, in retrospect, have saved lives and potentially been safer. So I had this conversation, had this opportunity with another sheriff, candidate for county sheriff several weeks ago on KMOJ, and we had a great conversation. And in that regard, there are subject matter experts in law enforcement and in the particular tactics. I know that St. Paul, I think, has done one no-knock warrant in the last 5 years. And people in St. Paul are not fundamentally different than people in Minneapolis. And so I don't think there's a need for it in almost every circumstance. If there was a hostage situation or something like that, I think it is conceivable to imagine a circumstance where it could be warranted. But 1 in 5 years in St. Paul seems like about right. Oh, I think you're on mute.
I am totally on mute. 2 years and still haven't gotten it down. Um, so tell us a little bit. So you talked about, your practice and on having happy,
Yeah.
mentally
Happy
well.
health. Well, it's happy, healthy attorneys, or sometimes we say happy, healthy people, and also attorneys.
Right. So what do you do to achieve that, and what would you do in as a county attorney to have an office of happy, healthy people?
Well, what we do in our current office, one, it starts with creating a culture, talking early and often about mental health, about chemical dependency issues, about creating a culture that when somebody makes a mistake, none of us like to make mistakes, right? And especially as a lawyer, we really hate to make mistakes. And if you make a mistake, there's a fear we get paid to be right all the time. We get paid to be fierce and strong all the time. And when you suffer a mental injury, or you have a mental lapse, or you have you cope chemically in ways that are not healthy, that can be embarrassing. And so we start our practice, and we've grounded our practice in creating a culture that's able to name and identify those practices, that people know they can talk about those situations with each other, with us, that there's accountability, but there's never reprisal. And I think all of our team members, they'd have to speak for themselves, but I think they would say that they know that their leaders advocate for them and are really rooting for them and their success, and don't see their shortcomings as an opportunity to be punitive, but it's an opportunity to be gracious is not the right word, but enthusiastically supportive. And so that can look like timeout, that has looked like very flexible scheduling, especially in the pandemic. We did that before the pandemic, but that served us very well as we dealt with civil unrest and just where our lawyers lived. That was, they were in communities that were very closely affected by the civil unrest. And so recognizing that people need to be whole humans, they need time to heal, they need space, and they need a collaborative environment, a collaborative and private environment. It's not that everybody's always talking about private things, but they know there's a space where they can do that. And that's part of my leadership and my management that I'm really proud of. And so thank you for asking about that, because we have worse than coal miners, worse than law enforcement officers. Lawyers suffer from chemical dependency and mental health issues.
So we have seen recently tough on crime rhetoric in response to the increases we've seen in crime, in particular the vehicle thefts, carjackings, etc. We've seen the tough on crime response coming and from local mayors as one source, and blaming of this increase in crime on the bail policy of the county, and also on sentencing. So what is your response to that?
So when it comes to bail, like I said, money is a terrible proxy for justice and liberty. And to give you an example, I have a client, not a violent crime, it's a non-violent crime, but she has been the victim of serial theft, identity theft, not of the online variety, but really personal violative theft. And she's been charged, this individual has been charged numerous times and has not yet been found guilty of any of those crimes. And sometimes within 48 hours of being charged, she posts $15,000 in bail and then immediately steals $20,000. And so you have a situation like that. That's a great illustration of why money is not a good proxy for risk assessment. And so being able to, we have a constitutional obligation to provide that. So without changing the Constitution, without statutory changes, we live within some parameters. But making data available to talk about how this is quite likely, almost certainly, disparately impacting people of color, being able to make that case is really strong. Being able to lean more in and refine risk assessment tools is really important. When it comes to, you said maybe tough on crime, multi-part question. I'll make sure I answer all of the just the general sentiment that crime is increasing. So what we need to do is be more punitive. When we had I don't know if it's similar. I think it was probably even worse in the 90s, rising crime in the late 80s, early 90s. We called community members. We started using language like super predators and saying, well, 3 strikes and you're out. And we have an idea. How about we lock people up for the rest of their natural lives? And that was not effective. What was effective was real profound community investment that we made and economic development that took place. And so there are 3 key indicators that correlate exceedingly well with people ceasing criminal behavior. And that's access to healthcare, particularly mental health care, particularly substance abuse. Dealing with substance abuse is probably the #1 thing you can do to disrupt patterns of crime. The second is housing. And the third is meaningful, gainful employment, which is why I have one of the great things about running for county attorney and advocating for change is you get to have conversations with a host of interesting people, with every large institutional leader that I have the opportunity to sit down with. And those are folks in our large corporations. And they're also folks that lead government agencies and institutions. I talk about creating a pipeline, a prison to labor pipeline, which is a little bit of a misnomer because most folks that are held accountable criminally, a lot of them do not go to prison necessarily, but they still have all the collateral consequences. So you don't have access to housing, it's hard to find a job, but whatever you do, don't return to whatever criminal or chemically induced behavior you were previously engaged in. So making sure it was great when we banned the box so that you could get an interview without having to disclose your criminal criminal past. What we've done in Richfield is we've made the expungement process potentially a default part of the plea bargaining process. We modified our forms for the plea bargaining process so that every time somebody has a plea bargain, they have the opportunity to have the conversation to say, is this right? Not just for expungement in 5 or 10 years, but if somebody is held accountable for the term of their probation, maybe a year, maybe 18 months, that crime is going to go off their record. When I say off their record, it's not, the government still sees it. The judge still sees it. So if you have something expunged, you can go get a job, but that doesn't mean we as the government, if you committed that similar crime, we're going to see that, we're going to continue to hold you accountable like you're continuing to engage in a criminal behavior. But it's really important that we take away these collateral consequences, these barriers to employment, these barriers to a life. And because we can be punitive to people for life, and we are, and that doesn't make us safer. And so if we want safety, we have to reckon with the deep economic injustices that are caused and perpetuated and facilitated by the criminal justice system. And fines are also a part of that too, because a lot of folks that are held accountable by our criminal justice system are poor. And so what a $500 fine means or a $300 fine, and we're not talking about restitution, being held accountable for what you stole, but there is a system that we've constructed at the city, at the county, and at the state level, and you have to get all those working together. But it says, well, we think you're going to have to pay hundreds or thousands of dollars. Yeah, and that's punitive. That's not actually making anybody safer. And so that's another way that we can reckon with rising crime, but not in a way that makes us safer, but doesn't crush people for life. And there are a lot of features of our justice system that do that.
Okay, I'm going to ask the other candidates this, so I'm going to ask you this one too, and then
Please.
I'll get into questions from the chat. So we know statistically that the vast majority of women that are incarcerated for either murder or manslaughter killed their abuser. So what do you have to say about that? and what, you know, and what would your approach, you know, as a county attorney be when these cases come to you?
Well, one, it's recognizing the abuse dynamics that are present in abusive relationships that overwhelmingly affect women, but don't exclusively affect women, and often women of color, and often women with disabilities. And the number of women with disabilities that are victimized is extraordinarily high. And so recognizing that on both sides, on the prosecutorial side and on the victim advocacy side, we need cultural competency, more cultural competency within our office, and that results from the attorneys that we hire, but that also results from the support staff that we have. Also, again, because the office is not like but a district attorney's office that simply deals with criminal offenses, but we are the lawyer for health and human services. We're the lawyer for the jails. We are the lawyer for every other line of business and service that the county provides, making sure that we have the opportunity as really the pointy tip of the governmental spear to all county resources, that we're looking to utilize every tool that we have. One, to hold people accountable. Just because there is abuse does not entitle somebody to kill somebody necessarily, or to commit violence themselves. So I want to be really clear. I want to recognize the harm, but I also want to recognize cycles of violence that have to be disrupted. But overwhelmingly, I think you're exactly right, and I appreciate you bringing that up. And it's recognizing those signs of abuse, recognizing those dynamics, and in implementing not just sentencing. And when you're talking about women being held accountable by the criminal justice system, the collateral consequences of separating mothers from their children during critical developmental years, it also really has to be taken into account, and because that is a deep generational scar for men and for women, but particularly with mothers.
Great, thank you for that. So Dr. Milan Sohani, who is also a board member of PAI, has joined us, and he would like to know, what is the one thing that separates you from other candidates?
You know, we have a lot of great candidates. You know, I'm sure they can speak for themselves. And so I will only say that for myself, I have a unique set of leadership experiences, having the opportunity not to manage, but to cast vision and to hold a bureaucracy accountable, and zealously advocate for a bureaucracy that's roughly the size of the Hennepin County Attorney's office and is less diverse than the Hennepin County Attorney's office. It has a more diverse community that we represent than the Hennepin County, and have the mental and social disciplines of having all the nasty things said about you in those contexts, internally within the bureaucracy and externally in community, when we deal with really painful, really tough things, and see incredible fruit. I also have the experience of managing lawyers, managing attorneys, of having the vision to create an organization and creating that organization. I also have the guts and the lived experience that says, I know where I want to plant this organization. I know the community that I feel akin to, and those are Black and brown folks and first-generation immigrants. And it is a powerful lived experience, not just to interact with folks at the margins historically on the worst days of their life. It is powerful to live every day and serve people every day in power, in success, and in overcoming. And that is unique and dynamic, and something that I have brought to every position of leadership I've been fortunate enough to have, which includes opportunities like the serving on the board of Minnesota Justice Coalition and Team Renewed that really advocates and has seen the fruit of these reforms. But it's also a reason why community members like George Floyd's family, I've had the privilege to be with them and support them, and then grateful to have their support for my campaign too.
Thank you, Simon.
Thank you, Jack.
So this question, I will read it as written. We may ask for more clarification, but the question is, how would you work with the schools that have police that use unnecessary force on young students, especially of color?
That's a good question, and I want to talk about what the county does and then what the city does. So at a city level, these are typically contracts that the city has, or that the police force in the school district, which school districts may or may not overlap with, or often overlap in different cities. So as a county attorney, we don't directly influence those contracts. And I'll just tell you as a council member, one of the things that frustrates me the most about a lot of these processes is that there is a constant cycling through of police officers. This is a duty post that somebody does for a year or two. And there are certain police officers who live for kids. They love kids, and this is a great fit for them. They will never be able to have a career as a student, as a school officer. And there are officers who frankly should never be in a school. And we have a system that says you should get that training. And so we set people up for failure because we put officers that are ill-equipped for this work in a situation where they don't have the tools and they don't have the temperament. So that's something that I will continue to advocate for change on the city level. When it comes to the county, I think specifically of one of the great supporters of my campaign is the county attorney, supervising attorney involved in truancy. And she's made the decision to, for the most part, not charge truancy as a crime, technically a crime, but she's made the decision that there are so many tools that we have, and it's not to suggest that truancy is not a huge crisis, but that the tools that we have to address that shouldn't be giving kids warrants and bringing kids in contact with law enforcement because of that failure. And so decisions like that need to continue to be supported within our office, because that's the discretion that we have as county attorneys to impact that school police dynamic. We're not the chief of police, we're not the school board, but in those spaces where we're in the gap, we have to use our discretion. And in her case, we have to use our cultural competency in her own lived experience to say, I know what's needed here. And so retaining and investing and trusting in leadership that's culturally competent, has clear vision, is getting good results like that is part of the tools. But again, and I'm not sure, and let me put my glasses on. I can't see whose question is that, Aquila, that part of what the county attorney has to do as well is engage in deep systemic reform within the office, so that we have an office of procedural integrity that can deal with complaints like this, and that we have a cohort or board or process that deals with the conflicts of interest between law enforcement charged with the crime when you're relying on law enforcement. And if you were here earlier, we have to name that conflict of interest, but we can engage folks like the state attorney general, like the Department of Justice, and bring other agencies into the organization, not just outsourcing them to Dakota County or to another county, because my concern with doing that is that I don't necessarily trust or know the values of the other, not that any of these county attorneys, I'm not saying anything about them negatively, but I have more confidence when we're bringing in multiple agencies, and multiple parts of government, that one colleague that we may rely on won't be treated differently.
Okay, thank
Thanks for
you.
the question. Oh, I think you're on
There we
mute.
go. Yep, got it. So what do you feel is the role of the county attorney when it comes to advocating with the state legislature as far as policies, laws, recommendations?
Yeah. It's essential, and who you choose to, how we choose to advocate. There's a county attorneys association that's statewide, and there are a lot of policies where there's going to be alignment, but there are a number of policies where we're not going to be aligned. And so it's not just advocating, but it's how we choose to build power and what we choose to advocate about. Right now we have an incredible budget surplus, which will not always be there, but we really have an opportunity to invest in not just public safety, but the infrastructure that can expand justice. And we've defunded the de novo program. That's an incredibly fruitful diversion program, scaling up restorative justice practices. The data is in there. It's not appropriate in every circumstance. It's especially appropriate to center restorative justice in the desires and the expectations of the victims and survivors of crime. But I think it has to include violent crime. But again, it starts with survivors. This is growth that we can have in the office. But in order to do that, we need resources. And we do that by collaborating with the county commission, but also really advocating for state dollars to scale programs that need to be scaled, that data shows are really effective.
Okay, well, I think we are about ready to wrap up. Greg, did you have any other questions?
No, I don't. I think we've been really thorough. Touched on everything, I think.
All right, well, thank you for joining us. If you want to share with people your website, how to get a hold of you, and you can also put that in the chat. And then anything you would like to say before we stop the recording.
Sure. Well, first, for everybody who made it all the way into, I think we're 90 minutes into the to the conversation. I've enjoyed this so much, but I want to thank everybody who listened to the end, and I hope you found it fruitful. Please, what you think, you can go to our website, simonforcountyattorney.com, and we have an extraordinary opportunity here in 2022 to do more than just vote for a new county attorney, but actually raise our expectation for what justice is, how we experience it, how we can demand it. We can demand more together. We can destroy really divisive narratives that says there's one group of people that want accountability for their government, and there's another group of people that want to be safe in their own homes. I've yet to have one conversation with anybody from Minnetonka or South Minneapolis or North Minneapolis who says, I really want police accountability, but I don't care about being safe in my own home, or I just want to be safe and I don't care about misconduct. So we have an opportunity to shatter those false narratives. I have a unique experience and ability where I haven't just talked about breaking down these walls. I have the privilege of doing that as a twice elected council member in a community I know well, in building a law firm that I'm exceedingly proud of, and in serving as a lawyer that, in addition to having a criminal practice, has a civil rights practice where for everybody who's a delegate for the first time in our state's history, people that are on probation, people that were immigrants without status have the opportunity to participate with us at the county convention. So Simon Trautmann, I'm asking for your vote. I'm asking for your support. And I'm asking for you to learn more, if you don't know about my campaign, to learn more about my campaign and find out why the last county attorney of the last DFL endorsed candidate for county attorney has endorsed our campaign, why George Floyd's family has endorsed our campaign, why we suburban council members like your colleague Kizzy Coakley and other mayors like Ron Case and Maria Reagan Gonzalez have joined our campaign along with community members. So thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Wilburn and Greg and everybody else who joined us. This is an incredible service that you're providing for everybody. So thank you for taking the time to do this.
All right, thank you. And I think with that, we can stop recording.